Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Pomerantz, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Keane Institute. And we are happy to have you here with us today for a book talk, Professor Lee Farrow, and for one of our series of Books in Wilson discussions. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to stay up to date with the Keane Institute by visiting our website and subscribing to our two blogs, The Russia File and Focus Ukraine, as well as our podcast, Keane X, and The Russia File. If you have any questions for our speaker today, you can send them to us by email at kenan@wilsoncenter.org, at Twitter at Keane Institute, or right on our Facebook page. Please be sure to include your name and affiliation when submitting a question. We will not be able to include your question without your name and affiliation. But I want to begin by introducing Professor Farrow. Professor Lee Farrow is the Distinguished Research Professor and Distinguished Teaching Professor and Chair of the Department of History and World Languages at Auburn University in Montgomery, Alabama. She is the author of several books on the history of Russian-American relations, including Alexis in America, the Grand Duke's Tour, and Seward's Folly, a new look at the Alaska Purchase, and her most recent book, The Catacazy Affair and the Uneasy Path of Russian-American Relations. In addition, Professor Farrow is an alumni of the Keane Institute's Title VIII Short-Term Scholar Program. And a note to our audience that you can find the book on the Bloomsbury Press website and use the code GLRTW7US for 35% off your order. So without further ado, Lee, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thanks so much for having me here today. I always enjoy speaking to at the Keane. And as I said before we began, I wish I could be there in person, but of course we are still living in the world of a pandemic. And so we have to make these various accommodations. So my background actually shows that I'm in India, but in fact, I'm in North Tennessee. I decided since I would have traveled this weekend, I would take a little mini vacation and come to the mountains and enjoy some of the fall foliage and get away for a bit. So, this project, the Catacazy Affair, examines an episode in Russian American history that took place in 1869 to 1872. And this is a conflict between Russia's minister to the United States, whose name was Constantin Catacazy, and various members of the administration of President Ulysses Grant. I came to this topic when I was working on one of my previous books. So when I was looking at the story of Alexis, the visit of Grand Duke Alexis, I had to tell the story, at least in a summary form, of the scandal involving the Russian minister. And as I did the research for that part of the book, I realized there was a much larger story here. I wasn't sure if it would be enough for an entire book, but when I finished with the Grand Duke Alexis book, I started poking into it a little more and discovered, in fact, it was a much larger scandal than I realized, and one that at the time was very well known. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, if it will allow me to do so. Okay, here we go. All right, so everybody should be able to see this at this point. Okay, all righty. So Constantin Catacazy arrived as the Russian minister to the United States in late summer of 1869, and he quickly developed a reputation as a difficult and dishonest man. Contemporaries called him odious and disagreeable, a phrase that I really love, and I'm just waiting for an opportunity to call a colleague that. In his book, Grant in Peace, From Appomattox to Mount McGregor, a personal memoir, Adam Badeau, who was a Union officer who served with Grant and later as a diplomat in London and Havana, described Catacazy at length, and his words are worth quoting in full because this is another one of those brilliant descriptions. So here's the quote. He was a man of effusive manners, professing great friendship and admiration for most of those he met, saying the most agreeable things, but without the art to make his hearers believe that his utterances were sincere. His flatteries were too fulsome, his falsehoods too plain. He was easy, but not elegant in behavior, smirked too much to be dignified, and the few who admired him, though many perceived him, his phase of cleverness. He tried to make himself acceptable to everybody, entertained liberally, paid all his visits and social duties punctiliously, yet was unmistakably vulgar. So this is typical of the kinds of descriptions that I found of Catacazy by his contemporaries. Overall, he was not well liked. By the fall of 1870, Secretary of State Hamilton Fish was writing in his diary, "It is a pity that one can never trust Catacazy or believe a word he says." The Russian government had instructed Catacazy to investigate the Perkins claim, a claim against Russia by an American citizen over an alleged defaulted contract, and he did so with relish. More than once, Catacazy wrote Fish that the claim was not deemed credible by the Russian government because of its, quote, essentially fraudulent character, and he condemned the entire worthlessness of the so-called claims. In addition, an article appeared in several American newspapers, purportedly an unsigned dispatch addressed to the Tsar that referred to the claim as, quote, an iniquitous fraud, and its supporters as would-be plunderers of the imperial government. The document also attacked the reputation of Hamilton Fish, calling him a very weak and vacillating man. Fish and others suspected that Catacazy was the author of the document and the one who inspired its publication. In fact, during his entire time as minister, Catacazy orchestrated the publication of numerous articles that criticized the US government and commented on various aspects of the Russian-American friendship, an enormous breach of diplomatic protocol. Catacazy repeatedly denied his involvement in these articles, but Fish and many others believed he was responsible. Catacazzy's involvement in this claim was not his only misstep with the US government, however. The Russian minister was also suspected of interfering in the resolution of the Alabama claims, a protracted and heated dispute between the United States and Great Britain that at times had seemed beyond resolution. In November of 1970, Fish wrote in his diary that he believed the Russian minister was on the lookout for complications for Great Britain and in his insidious but most insincere way endeavors to persuade me that a great opportunity presents for their adjustment. It is a pity that one can never trust Catacazy or believe a word he says. By early 1871, rumors were mushrooming that Catacazy was attempting to derail the settlement of the Alabama claims. Catacazy denied any meddling, but Fish believed he was guilty of the charge. By June of 1871, Fish and Grant had had enough of Catacazy and requested his recall. The ensuing negotiations about Catacazzy's departure and his restricted role in the interim were extensive and occasionally heated, and involved laborious debates over specific words and phrases used to describe the terms of the Russian minister's recall. The matter was further complicated by the fact that the Tsar's son, Grand Duke Alexis, was departing for the US, and the Russian government made it clear that the visit could not occur without a Russian representative there. Consequently, Fish and Grant compromised and permitted Catacazy to stay through Alexis's visit, but he was to depart as soon as the Grand Duke's visit ended. Even this decision became a point of contention, since some members of the Russian government took offense at the tone of the language, which in their minds implied that the United States would determine when the Grand Duke would have to leave. Even at home in the United States, the conflict was an object of scrutiny and speculation. Many criticized Fish and Grant for their failure to better navigate the scandal and worried about the future of the Russian-American friendship. In fact, the unpleasantness combined with the Perkins claim and other disagreements began to negatively impact the success of American businessmen in Russia. The Catacazy Affair is more than a footnote in history. Internationally, the affair raised critical questions about diplomatic protocol and the recall of foreign representatives, and it would be subsequently cited in books on international law. It became an interesting example of a nation's power to reject or request the removal of a foreign representative who betrayed certain expectations or rules about diplomacy. It encompassed an enormous amount of correspondence between Russia and the United States, and it was also the first scratch on the shiny veneer of the Russian-American friendship that had been widely proclaimed and celebrated in the recent years after the Alaska Purchase. Domestically, the scandal raised a variety of important questions about congressional purview, the legal rights of American citizens in suing foreign entities, and diplomatic protocol. The lawsuit of Benjamin Perkins and his heirs pushed or exceeded the boundaries of congressional purview, and many in Washington disagreed with the notion of a private dispute influencing international affairs, for example, the appropriations for Alaska. Although the US government did request that the claim be examined and given due consideration, the matter was not clearly one that required government intervention. In fact, there was some debate about the American government's responsibilities in supporting its citizens who engage with a foreign government, a question that still resurfaces today. Catacazy's methods in the case, specifically his habit of taking confidential or private matters to the press, highlighted the importance of diplomatic protocol and the old saying about discretion being the better part of valor. American historians will appreciate this story as another example of how the personalities and behaviors of individuals in a government can influence policy at the highest levels of power. Most scholars of American history have never likely heard of this diplomatic disaster, yet a full discussion of the Catacazy Affair adds to the overall portrait of Grant's administration of one that was rife with scandal and corruption. At the time, it was front page news, offering readers the excitement of political intrigue and the salaciousness of social scandal. Finally, the meddling of the Russian minister in affairs of the American government in general and his use of the press in particular is particularly interesting in the 21st century as the United States once again faces the problem of interference by Russia or Russians in internal affairs. The Catacazy scandal foreshadows more recent events, specifically Russian exploitation of social media to disseminate disinformation and create divisiveness in the already polarized American public. The focus of my presentation, however, today is another aspect of the Catacazy Affair, the unspoken power of women in politics in the years before they could vote. The Russian minister's wife, Olga Fitzjames, was born in France in 1828 into a noble family. At the age of 19, she was married to an Italian duke who would serve as minister plenipotentiary of the King of Two Sicilies in Brazil, and later as secretary of the Italian legation in Berlin. While she was married, however, Olga met Catacazy and they fell in love. Some sources say they met in Rome, others say Brazil, where in 1851, Catacazy was sent to serve as a secretary to the Russian legation in Rio de Janeiro for a brief period. Whatever the case may be, at some point during this period, she either divorced her husband or she ran off with Catacazy. When Catacazy came to the United States as minister in 1869, he brought Olga with him as his wife. Several sources say that Madame Catacazy was accepted at the time of their arrival in the American capital. As far as can be determined, she attempted to fulfill her role as the Russian minister's wife, hosting regular receptions and appearing beside her husband when appropriate. The Washington Daily Morning Chronicle attributed a brilliant reception to her in January 1870, and she also attended a ball given by the British minister and was praised for her white silk dress and overall magnificent costume. She hosted another reception in February. These receptions were attended by cabinet members and their wives, including the Fishes. That same month, in February, both the Catacazys attended a state dinner given by the president. The American press raved about the beauty of the Russian minister's wife. Olga was described as, quote, a woman of remarkable beauty, with a clear complexion, a lovely figure, and, quote, a wealth of golden hair, which all admit to be natural in color and quantity, and that rare shade about which poets and painters rave. Her eyes were full, lustrous, and of a dark blue, and her beauty was enhanced by the tastes of a Parisian and the instincts of an artist. Her demeanor was also the subject of praise. One paper described her manners as very fascinating, adding, "She knows how to pay dainty little compliments, though her vocabulary of English words is not large." The women of Washington society assessed one another critically, tallying points for beauty, fashion, manners, and polish. So such lavish compliments in the American press carried more weight than one might imagine. Adam Badeau, Grant's associate and chronicler, noted of Mrs. Catacazy that she was fascinating to men, quote, dressed with gorgeous taste, and her superb neck and arms, long golden hair, and melting eyes made many think that Catacayzy's sin had not been without its provocation. Olga's beauty undoubtedly made some women jealous, but it was the stories of her past that made her presence objectionable. According to Badeau, when she arrived in Washington, she and her husband may have hoped that her previous indiscretion had been forgotten, but, quote, the ladies remembered it, and those who were in power held a consultation as to whether the envoy's wife should be received. Though she would not have been received in public life under normal circumstances, Badeau declares it was decided to ignore her past, lest to notice it might complicate international relations. At some point, however, this decision to turn a blind eye shifted. Many sources hint that the ostracization of Madame Catacazy began with Julia Keane Fish, the wife of Secretary of State Hamilton Fish. Mrs. Fish was, according to one newspaper, the leading representative of officialdom in society and the embodiment of womanly grace and dignity. Another paper described her as dignified and reserved, but never haughty, quietly attentive to all her guests, makes each feel at ease without making the slightest parade about it. Hamilton Fish had served as governor of New York from 1849 to 1850 and as the senator from New York from 1851 to 1857. So his wife fully understood her role when he became Secretary of State in 1869. During the Grant administration, Julia Keane Fish set many of the precedents for social calls and invitations, and was often the first official wife to visit new congressional wives and invite them to tea. The Fishes were wealthy and did a great deal of entertaining, spending as much as $75,000 per year on receptions and dinners. Given these many years as a, quote, first lady, Julia was well experienced in the etiquette of entertaining and the politics of the parlor. Too experienced, in fact, to not foresee the ramifications of excluding a prominent couple from an important social event. In November 1870, Julia Keane Fish hosted a grand diplomatic dinner in honor of the Joint High Commission for the Settlement of the Alabama Claims. Every foreign minister or ambassador was invited except Constantin Catacazy. Such a slight, in the words of the Milwaukee Sentinel, quote, sent the poisoned arrow through the quivering heart of one woman superior to them all in breeding, accomplishments, and beauty. The Russian minister, of course, was angered by the exclusion of himself and his wife from a dinner of such significance, and it became one more irritant between him and the Secretary of State. In December 1870, a month after the alleged snubbing, Catacazy raised the issue with Fish in one of his frequent meetings. Fish recorded that Catacazy stated that, quote, an article which lately appeared in some papers reflecting on his wife had been sent to him. Fish made no further comment on the matter in his diary, but the article in question was likely one that appeared in the Daily National Republican in early December 1870. It stated that the relationship between Fish and Catacazy was less than cordial, attributing it to the fact that the Catacazys had been partly ignored last winter in the social relations required by the conventionalities of diplomacy, and their absence from the diplomatic dinners at the White House finally became the subject of public comment. Even had the dinner in question not been such a high-profile affair, the blow would have been a sharp one. Receptions and dinners were central to the fabric of proper society, and the bar was set extremely high. Society life in the second half of the 19th century followed certain rules of etiquette regarding invitations and attendance. Prominent women in society typically held weekly open receptions of several hours, and visits by and to other ladies also required adherence to certain guidelines. In an 1873 Guide to Social Life in Washington, the female author specified that a calling card should be left at the home of a person one visits, whether or not the person being visited was at home, but especially if they were not. How one responded to a visit or missed visitor also had its rules and subtle meanings. Quote, an intervening period of 3 days marks high breeding, as it evinces your pleasure at forming the acquaintance, so that a return visit within a day or so is therefore a delicate compliment. As the arbiters of etiquette and the ringmasters of the social world, women were keenly aware of the unwritten rules and the corresponding slights and nods. It was well known that omitting someone from a dinner or party was perceived as an insult, an intentional snub which communicated the hostess's opinion of the excluded party. Likewise, failure to attend was also interpreted as an insult. Julia Fish certainly knew these rules, and her choice to exclude the Russian minister and his wife communicated a message to other women in Washington society that Madame Catacazy was no longer to be accepted, tolerated perhaps, but not accepted. It is certain that the inclusion or exclusion of the Catacazys became a point of contention between the Russian minister and the Secretary of State. In May, Catacazy complained to Fish once again about the social exclusion of his wife. Fish recorded in his diary that Catacazy, quote, refers to not having been invited to dine with me, to which I reply that he may be assured that the fact of his not being thus invited will not be the subject of any boasting letter from me or from my wife. Fish had been told that Madame Catacazy had bragged about excluding the Fishes in a letter to someone, and that letter was being shared with glee in New York. The minister denied knowledge of any such letter. Following this meeting, Fish dedicated an entire letter to the social aspect of the Catacazy affair to the American minister in St. Petersburg, Andrew Curtin. The Secretary of State had recently given a dinner in honor of Baron Friedrich von Geralt, the German minister to the United States, who was retiring after more than 20 years of service, and someone Fish considered a personal friend. The Catacazys were not on the guest list, and Fish was not surprised that the Russian minister confronted him about it, nor was he surprised to see something appear about it in the press. As Fish told Curtin, quote, as I anticipated when he spoke of the subject, it has since become a matter of newspaper content. Mr. Catacazy has a peculiar infelicity of getting all his troubles, real, imagined, and entirely figured and without foundation, into the public prints. Fish underscored that despite Catacazzy's poor behavior, he and his wife had been invited to all official dinners and receptions as his rank entitled him. Catacazy, however, had excluded Fish from a dinner for the Joint High Commission earlier that spring, the subject of the previously mentioned letter. For this reason, Fish felt no obligation to invite the Catacazys to his home. Since Catacazy would likely report this to his government, he instructed Curtin to use his letter as needed to counter any misinformation caused by the Russian minister's version of events. Even British diplomats were aware of the rumors about Madame Catacazy. In September 1871, the British representative in St. Petersburg wrote to the Foreign Secretary, I understand also that alleged failings since her arrival in the U.S. on the part of Madame Catacazy, who did not leave Russia with an unblemished reputation, have complicated the question, and that Mrs. Fish has ceased to receive her. The Catacazy affair is reminiscent of an episode that occurred 50 years earlier during the administration of Andrew Jackson. In 1829, Jackson selected John Henry Eaton to be his Secretary of War. Eaton was a close friend and confidant of Jackson, so his selection as Secretary of War was not a surprise to anyone. Eaton was married to Margaret Eaton, a widow with 2 children, whose family owned a boarding house and hotel where many Washington officials stayed, including both Jackson and Eaton, when Congress was in session or when other duties called them to the Capitol. As a frequent resident, Andrew Jackson had come to know and grow fond of Margaret. Washington society, however, was less enamored. Margaret was a widow from a working class family, and her marriage to John Eaton occurred less than a year after her first husband's death. There were rumors that she and Eaton had actually begun their affair much earlier while her husband was away at sea. Beautiful, feisty, and outspoken, nothing about Margaret Eaton fit into the rules of proper society, and the Washington wives made this abundantly clear. Though Margaret attempted to enter the capital's world of polite society, making the appropriate visits and leaving calling cards as required by contemporary etiquette, the wives of Jackson's cabinet members refused to return her visits. They snubbed her at dinners, receptions, and parties, thereby taking a private affair to the public and into politics. Even Jackson's own relatives refused to associate with Margaret. Jackson spent 2 years defending Margaret, but it was a losing battle. The wives in Washington could be vicious and ruthless. As Jackson once told Margaret, quote, "I had rather have live vermin on my back than the tongue of one of the Washington women on my reputation." He eventually came to understand the power of women in this particular arena. Though he tried to convince several of his cabinet members to order their wives to receive Margaret Eaton, the men would not. Even under the threat of termination, at least 3 of Jackson's cabinet members insisted that it was the right and duty of the women to dictate the rules of social intercourse and the job of their husbands to support their decisions. None of them dared to intervene in the strict and vicious world of women and social etiquette. In the end, the Washington wives were victorious. All but one of Jackson's cabinet members resigned rather than interfere in the politics of female society. There are some strong similarities between the Eaton affair and the Catacazy affair. Both Margaret Eaton and Olga Catacazy were described by contemporaries as exceptional women. Margaret was a vivacious beauty who radiated sexuality in a manner that was deemed highly improper. And because of her family's business, she had a comfortable rapport with men, unusual in that era for women of the upper class. Olga was described as exceptionally beautiful, and the press made much of her grace and charm, declaring that the withdrawal of the Catacazys represented, quote, "the triumph of Mrs. Fish and her following of the plain but proper Washington matrons." In both cases, the women challenged the expectations of refined society, daring to attempt an entree with no regard to their unconventional or scandalous past. And in both cases, it was the world of women and their rules for societal acceptance and interaction that determined the fates of men. The Eaton affair and the Catacazy affair both underscore the fact that women, though still excluded from the suffrage, could exert a great deal of influence in the world of politics. American women had long played an influential role in society in its more general definition, thanks to the antebellum belief that women were morally superior. Benevolence in its various manifestations had largely been the work of women. After the Civil War, benevolent activism became more engaged in pushing for changes that required government action, leading to a greater intersection of charitable work and politics. In the cases of Margaret Eaton and Olga Catacazy, the Washington wives were displaying a different kind of power, one exercised in the world of parties and dinners and social visits, where etiquette dictated certain behaviors and courtesies, and the failure to observe these expectations could have serious repercussions. This arena of polite society seems superficial and perhaps even silly to modern democratic readers. But in a world where women were known only by their husbands' names and titles, it should be no surprise that they fiercely defended the rules and protocols of society and their places in the social pecking order. This was particularly true in Washington, where private society unavoidably intersected with politics. Moreover, American women exercised queen bee status in this arena, unlike in Europe, where men dictated the rules of social life and even in many cases authored the books of good manners. By the end of the 19th century, ambition and social drive were the outstanding characteristics of the American woman. As one man wrote in March of 1872 of his soon-to-be wife, quote, "She rules me as only American women rule men." In the end, how much the drama surrounding Olga Catacazy contributed to the downfall of her husband is impossible to determine. The Russian minister certainly alienated and angered several important people in the administration. and his intrigues and breaches of protocol were the primary cause of his dismissal. His personal life played a role also, however. The social crisis created by the disapproval and perhaps jealousy of the Washington wives was very important. Women could not vote or participate in politics officially, but they could influence certain situations and exercised a specific power in society that men dare not challenge. John W. Foster, in his diplomatic memoirs, implied that the Russian couple should have known better. He observed that scandals among diplomats in Europe were so common that they were hardly noticed. But in America, diplomats found, quote, the standard of society very different, and some of them are inclined to look upon it as prudish and puritanic. The Russian minister would have also known this, but, quote, Catacazy and others of his day lived quite in disregard of the ideas prevailing in Washington, quote. In general, Catacazy ignored many of the rules that he should have followed, and this is why he ended up being recalled. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee. Again, if you have questions for our speaker, you can send them by email at kennan@wilsoncenter.org, to our Twitter account at Kennan Institute, or right on our Facebook page. This is a fascinating display of mid-19th century chivalry and social etiquette. I want to begin the question, though, by asking a little bit about Catacazy's background. He, in fact, wasn't from an established Russian family, as you write. And to what extent did the Russian foreign ministry or rely on non-Russians to pursue diplomacy? Obviously, a lot of the generals eventually were not Russian, but to what extent was it atypical for someone of Greek origin to play such a prominent role in foreign policy?
So yeah, so you're right. He was of Greek background. His father had also been a diplomat and had served the Russian government in a variety of capacities. And I will say that he, in doing it was very difficult to find research about his father, but what little research I could find on his father also had a reputation of being kind of an intriguer. So Catacazy came by his intriguing nature naturally, it would seem. And I'll also mention that that frequently in the press and in correspondence, private correspondence that I read, people referred to his Greekness as, like, well, what do you expect? He's a Greek, or, stuff about him being kind of sneaky and that being a trait of being Greek. So there was some ethnic stereotyping going on as well when people talked about Catacazy and his shenanigans. I don't know statistically how many foreigners were in the employ of the Russian diplomatic service, but there, of course, was a long history of this going back to Peter the Great, and it was not atypical. It may not have been typical, but it certainly was not atypical to see someone of foreign background working within the Russian ministries.
Oh, thank you, Lee. Again, if you have questions, you can email them to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, Twitter @Kennan Institute, or right on our Facebook page. Our first question is from Joseph Bradley at the University of Tulsa, Emeritus. Does this suggest that even now, during a low point in US-Russian relations, we should not overplay Russian intrusion in American politics, as well as shrill the shrill anti-Western rhetoric in the Russian media, because a lot of engagement and cooperation are still proceeding?
Well, I think what it tells us is that, there is a long history. The relationship with Russia, I mean, this is why the title of the book is The Uneasy Path of Russian-American Relations, because in all of the research that I've done in my past projects and even the ongoing research that I'm doing moving forward into a new project. And anyone who studies Russian history knows this. I'm not saying anything that's rocket science. There's been a very complicated relationship between the United States and Russia, and that goes back to the 19th century. And I think that those of us who work within this field are always looking for opportunities to highlight the moments of cooperation, because we would like, as scholars, to be able to cooperate with our fellow scholars in Russia. We'd like to see exchanges of various sorts. And we tend to try and keep the political side separate from the intellectual side as much as possible, so that these kinds of ongoing collaborations can continue in any environment. But it's certainly a challenge to continue that kind of thing when there are concerns about these kinds of violations on either side. So I'm certainly not an expert in current events and what's going on, with the allegations of Russian interference in American governmental affairs. I know that it's gotten in the way of some of the things that I've wanted to do, where like talks have been canceled because of these kinds of arguments. So as I said, I'd like to keep that separate from the political side, but I know that it doesn't really happen that way in reality. So, but I think this just tells us that, this is not a new concern. And Russia and the United States have just always had this very complicated relationship. We've been, in current parlance, right? We've always been kind of frenemies, right? Like friends and enemies at the same time. And there's, of course, even a book that's titled that.
So how was this affair reported in Russia? I mean, Russia had a fairly active press by the 1860s and 1870s. Did they say, oh, these prudish Americans, what's upsetting them?
So the part regarding his wife, I really didn't find any mention of that in the press whatsoever. And I mean, much of what was in the press was, it would be like reprints of American articles or British articles, and then commentary or responses to British and American articles. And by and large, the main newspapers, the St. Petersburg Journal and others, the Golos, they took the Russian government side in all of this, right? And defending the Russia's honor, because of course one can imagine, even if Catacazy was, getting into all sorts of shenanigans, that for the Russian government, this was an embarrassment. Even if it was true, it was an embarrassment, and it, reflected poorly on them. And they certainly had a sense of honor about, they felt like their sense of honor was being called into question or tarnished by this scandal. So, but the Russian newspapers, by and large, supported Russia and the Russian government's decisions. And some of the articles, according to, what I read, were likely actually, prepared by the foreign ministry. And so, it wouldn't be surprising then that they were sort of the voice of the government at that point. I will say one thing that I couldn't go into today, but it is a subject of a section of the book, and it's something that I'm going to talk about at that conference in January that I spoke of. Is that there was a lot of arguing over the language that was used in all of these documents. So again, on the Russian side, there was a point of pride in making it clear that they were recalling him and it was their decision and all this sort of thing, right? Catacazy himself tried to stake out his own little claim and say that, or tried to defend his own honor by saying like, oh, he had voluntarily asked to be recalled, which is not true at all. And then meanwhile, on the American government side, they wanted to make it crystal clear that they had asked for the recall, that it was a recall, not a leave of absence, and that he was not welcome to hang around in the United States after his term ended, that he needed to go home. They did not want him staying. So there was all this arguing in correspondence over the use of various phrases. So whether the United States said that they would tolerate Catacazy during Grand Duke Alexis's visit, and then the Russian government took issue with that word, saying it had a bad connotation. The American minister in St. Petersburg, Andrew Curtin, said that was your word. You used it first, and that's why I started using it. And there's like an unbelievable amount of correspondence back and forth just over the use of the word tolerate. And then there were a series of letters arguing about whether or not it was a recall or some other terminology. And then there was an argument about the point that I mentioned in the presentation, where the United States said that Catacazy could stay until the Grand Duke's visit was over, and the Russian government said that makes it sound like you're going to tell us when the Russian Grand Duke's visit is over. And I mean, that just became like a whole separate thing that I had to I sort of put all that aside. And then at the very end, after I had sorted out the whole story and told the whole story, then I went back and figured out the fights over these words. And I was able to write a whole section just talking about the arguments over terminology and phraseology, which is tedious, but very interesting at the same time, because each choice, and any of you who work in diplomacy or anything would know this, right? Like every word choice has enormous meaning and enormous implications. And both governments were keenly aware of what the implications were and what that meant for them, and whether or not they were the ones controlling the situation or the other government was controlling the situation. And it was all very interesting and a bit amusing as they argued over these words.
So how did Ambassador Catacazy enjoy the trip with the Grand Duke? Was he accepted? Did he get to go to all the arms factories? Did he get to hang out with all the celebrities, or was he ostracized?
So he only stayed with him for part of the trip. Actually, he didn't travel with him the whole time. So he was with him on the first part of the trip. And actually the descriptions are pretty humorous, because he was constantly making these maladroit toasts and kind of putting his foot in his mouth or saying something kind of weird. He made some comment about the Statue of Justice is doing X, Y, and Z. But, if there were a statue of diplomacy, she would have her finger over her mouth, and, something I certainly have learned. And he was constantly making these comments that drew attention to his plight. And in one point, I think it was at the White House, Hamilton Fish said he was suddenly limping and walking with a cane, as though he were trying to get attention and get people to talk to him. But basically he was kind of persona non grata, except as the Grand Duke's, guide. So he could introduce the Grand Duke at all these events, and then he really wasn't supposed to interact with people. And clearly he was not a man who was accustomed to being on the sidelines. And so he did various things to garner attention during the short time that he did travel with Alexis.
Our next question comes from Lucian Kim. He asks, did you get a chance to investigate the motivations for Catacazy's actions? Have you concluded that this was simply his personality, or was he acting on any kind of instruction from his government?
Good question. So, I mean, I think clearly some of the things that he was doing were on instruction of his government. So he was supposed to investigate the Perkins affair. He was supposed to, I'm sure he was supposed to feel out the American government on, the renunciation of the Black Sea Clause, and, how that might impact the Alabama claims and vice versa. But the problem is he had no tact. And I think that it's safe to say that this was his personality, based on the primary sources, not the newspapers, but the personal papers of various people, and also then based on the way he spent the rest of his life. So he ended up in France. He spent the rest of his life defending himself and trying to argue that he really had not done all the things that he had been accused of doing. But he didn't know how to keep his mouth shut. So he was instructed by the Tsar. He received instruction from the foreign ministry: do not write anything about this. Do not write anything about this. And he wrote, a long document, over 100 pages in French, which he had published, in which he defends himself. And he goes through point by point all the things that people have said about him and defends himself. And he was explicitly warned not to do this by the Russian government, and told that he would have his pension removed. And he did it anyway. And then he spent the rest of his life in France, writing letters over and over again to anyone who would listen, asking them for help in getting an office again. I mean, in one case, he even suggests like, oh, by the way, there's like this, old guy who's working in this office, and he'd probably be happy to retire, so you could give me his position. I mean, he was so bold and brazen, and there's a difference between advocating for oneself and making oneself an absolute bore and bother to everyone. And he really took it too far. And he was implicated while he was living in Europe in a couple of other scandals, scandals that involved newspaper articles that mysteriously appear in the press and say something that probably nobody could know except him or a few other people. And he always denied involvement. And of course, it's possible that, because there was a scandal involving that sort of thing with him before, he was the first person people looked to. But it also seems suspicious in my eyes that, this kind of scandal seemed to follow him wherever he went. So I think it was his personality. I think he was ambitious, and he lacked tact, and he lacked the kind of polish and nuance that is needed in diplomatic relations. And he was a bit too much like a bull in a china shop, and probably too motivated by self-interest.
So who nominated him? If he had this reputation that preceded him, how did he get to this job?
Gorbachev, the foreign minister, liked him. Gorbachev, the foreign minister, liked him, and he I was never able to really kind of get any better information about like how this relationship between them started, why the foreign minister felt such protection over Catacazy. But in many primary sources, both in Russia and even from Great Britain, people said like the foreign minister likes him. That's the only reason he got this job in the first place. Several times, he had been put up for this job before or other jobs, and he'd been denied. And, so it's taken, the foreign minister has had to work really hard to get him this position. But the foreign minister seemed to be the only person who was really kind of protecting him. And even eventually then the foreign minister had to just give up. I mean, by the time this scandal broke and Catacazy was being recalled, it was clear to the foreign ministry that the stories about Catacazy were true. And in fact, there had been accusations, and I think those were probably borne out as the American minister worked with the foreign ministry in St. Petersburg, that Catacazy was misrepresenting things to his government. So he would send a letter to the foreign ministry reporting on how something was going, and it was entirely different, or if not entirely different, it was a significant adaptation of what was really going on in Washington and how Catacazy was really faring with regard to the Perkins claim or some other thing. So he was manipulating information and not reporting the truth to his own government. And I think eventually they figured that out. And so in the end, that's why, I mean, he became kind of, he continued to work within the government, but he could never get another position of prominence. And no one seemed to really want to stick up for him or step up for him. And there's even one letter from one of his friends who says to him, like, isn't it possible that you did something while you're in Washington? You have a reputation for not holding your tongue. Isn't it possible that you did something? And, you just need to zip it, is basically what they were telling him. And he just wouldn't listen.
A follow-up question from Lucien Kim. What kind of communications with their respective capitals did foreign emissaries have at this point in time? Were they much more autonomous than modern day ambassadors?
So by and large, everything occurred by letter and telegram, of course. And one of the complicated things, of course, in both for them at the time and for the historian trying to go through these records, is trying to create the chronology of the correspondence, because letters and telegrams often overlapped. And so they are sometimes responding to something that actually or maybe they're writing about something and they haven't received the letter yet that they should be responding to. It gets very confusing. And And so sometimes you have to, they are already writing about something that that the other person doesn't know about yet because they haven't received the previous letter. So that can be very complicated, but yeah, everything took place in letters and telegrams. And so it's, the communication is slow. And in fact, during the summer of 1871, when the American government was saying sort of like, let's get this guy recalled, the foreign minister was away in, I think, someplace in Germany, recovering, taking the water, something like that, right? And so the acting foreign minister felt like he couldn't really take any action on his own. He had to wait for the actual foreign minister to return, and the American government was, Hamilton Fish was growing increasingly frustrated with the slow pace of this, and he kept trying to prompt our minister in St. Petersburg to like move things along, and our minister's saying like, I can't do anything. And Hamilton Fish even makes a point of saying something along the lines of like, just because he's not in Russia doesn't mean he can't be communicated with, like so they can telegram him there, or send him a telegram there. So, so the complication of communication, the slow pace of communication definitely made these kinds of affairs more difficult. And occasionally, there was the concern about things that got lost and were never received. There were some, our minister in St. Petersburg said something about along the lines of like, sometimes he was handing his correspondence through a British, asking the British guy to pass it on because he was sure that if it went through Russian channels, it was being read. So he said like, I just know there's no point in me even putting it, sealing it or putting it in code because they know what it is. If I, so he was sending it through the British representative. So it was very complicated, and there were a couple points at which the Secretary of State got really angry at our minister in St. Petersburg because he said that he had misinterpreted some coded messages or he had not written something correctly, and so there was an extra level of complexity to diplomatic negotiations because of just the difficulty of communicating.
Again, if you have questions for our speaker, you can send them by email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, to our Twitter @Kennan Institute, or write on our Facebook page. An additional question for you, Lee. How did the British feel about Catacazy? Obviously, he's involved in the Alabama affair at various times. So what was their impression of him?
Yeah, so the British correspondence that I read from that period of time, from various people within the administration, none of them liked him either. And if they didn't know him personally well enough to dislike him, they reported that other people disliked him. So I will say he had a couple of friends in the United States. So when all of this was going on, Catacazy did receive a couple of letters from friends saying how they supported him. And maybe there were many more of those that just didn't get preserved. I did research in the Foreign Ministry archive in Moscow. So I went through Catacayzy's papers, and there were a few of these friendly letters, but not very many. He also received a death threat. So in October of 1871, Catacazy received a death threat, and it was interesting because it was, of course, unsigned. It was I think it was just dated October. It didn't have an actual date. So I had to look at the postmark and kind of try and figure out what date it was mailed, but it was in October of 1871, and it threatened to kill. It said like, you'll be lucky if you get out of this country without me bashing in your head. And it called him various names. And so some Americans clearly took a strong dislike to him, but overall, I would say, the preponderance of the evidence shows that he was not liked by many.
And to what extent did Catacazy contribute to the poor reputation of Grant's administration? Did he kind of highlight corruption? Did he kind of try to make corruption or highlight some of the financial dealings of the Grant administration?
Oddly enough, he didn't do a lot of that. Now, occasionally he might make a snarky reference to something, regarding, like Grant's brother-in-law is doing this or something like that, but really not too much. So he kind of missed an opportunity there, because if he knew more about what was going on there, and one suspects that given his desire and his nosiness, to just his desire to know what was going on everywhere, he probably did know a lot of those things. And it's kind of interesting that he didn't decide to exploit that more. He accused Hamilton Fish of some shady dealings. He accused Hamilton Fish of trying to, sell him some worthless pieces of property, because Catacazy was also entrusted with finding some land upon which to build a Russian Orthodox church in New York. And Hamilton Fish had some lots, which he told Catacazy he'd be willing to sell him. And Catacazy then accused Fish of trying to inflate the price on those lots. And in turn, Fish accused Catacazy of inflating the actual price of what he paid for the land so that he could keep some of it. So Fish accused Catacazy of telling the Russian government he had spent a certain amount of money when in fact he had spent less, and that he had bribed someone to put a different amount of money on the actual sale documents. I could not confirm that, but there were documents from other Americans who investigated who seemed to believe that it was true at the time. So he seemed not to take advantage of the possibilities there in looking into Grant's private affairs or Grant's governmental scandals. And I guess in that way it was a missed opportunity. He could have actually had something there he could have held on to, it would have been real, as opposed to the sort of weird make-believe scandals that he tried to start.
So one last question. Grant actually goes to Russia after his presidency, and is at least received by the Tsar. Can you talk a little bit about his reception in Russia, and what was his impression after all this scandal and these bad relations with the Russian minister to the United States?
So I will tell you that, there were people who told Grant he shouldn't go to Russia because of what had happened. And I should add that because of the Catacazy scandal, Grand Duke Alexis, when he visited Washington, D.C., was given a reception by President Grant and Mrs. Grant, but it was very small. It was official. There were no speeches. There was no dinner. There was no ball. There wasn't even like sitting down and having tea or anything. It was very, very formal and official. And of course, in every other city, Grand Duke Alexis had been received with enormous pomp and circumstances, and there had been balls and parades and all sorts of other things, at least a dinner. And so this was very problematic. The Russian royal family, Russian people were a bit offended that Grant seemed to kind of snub Alexis, but it was all because of the Catacazy thing, because they were tolerating Catacazy's presence, and had they done more of that, then of course they would have had to tolerate him for even longer. And so Catacazy's presence really put a damper on Alexis's trip to the White House and the visit with the president and his cabinet. And so when it was time for Grant to visit Russia, there were people who told him he shouldn't go, but he decided to go anyway. He was received by Alexander, but he was made to wait quite a bit of time, apparently. And there was no dinner. He was not invited to dinner. So there was a reception, or there was an actual reception, as in like they met, but there was no big dinner or anything like that, which would have been the norm under different circumstances. And others had, other people working within the what's the word I'm looking for? Our offices in St. Petersburg, I'm drawing a blank all of a sudden, our embassy in St. Petersburg had said, like, people here remember that. They're kind of ticked about it. And it has actually, some American business people have actually had to, kind of answer for it. Like they've lost contracts and things because people have been kind of ticked off about this. So Grant was received, but not given the warm reception and dinner that he would probably have been given otherwise.
Well, the book is called The Catacazy Affair and the Uneasy Path of Russian-American Relations. I'm going to repeat that if you go to the Bloomsbury Press website, you can use the code GLRTW7US for a 35% discount on your order. I'd like to thank Professor Farrow for this excellent presentation and our audience for joining us today. And we look forward to you joining us for future Kennan Institute events. Thanks so much.
Bye, thank you.